Hey everyone, my name's Adam White. I'm a solution architect at Salesforce and also a contributor to unofficialsf.com. I thought it'd be good to put together a little presentation about a lay of the land of actions and components and where you can find them, when's the right time to use them, and then I guess for lack of a better term, a sizzle reel of a few different actions highlighted from various sources online. Although I do work at Salesforce, the thoughts and ideas in this presentation are my own and not that of Salesforce. So just to talk a little bit about the when you'd use them. So we all know that flow is really powerful, but it does have its limits. And one of the first things that you should really do when you're getting into flow is read the great article that was posted on the Architect's blog called The Architect's Guide to Record Triggered Automation. It basically has a bunch of stuff on roadmap, on some of the various limitations of flow, and when you should start thinking about using something like invocable Apex. So here are 4 main use cases that I think about when I want to use an action. The first one is large data volumes. So you may or may not know, but flow currently can only hit 2,000 steps or elements in a single flow interview. So what that means is if you're going to be looping over something like 1,800 records, you're pretty likely to hit flow's element limit. So that should be a cue to say, all right, I think I need to enlist the help of some Apex here. The other one is limits on collection processing. So what we mean by collection processing is performing actions or looking for stuff within a record collection or a collection variable within flow. If you want to find a record within a giant collection, you have to loop over it, which presents a problem if you are in that first scenario where you have a lot of records in a collection. So if you wanted a simple record or maybe 10 records, you got to loop over all of them. And Apex has lots of handy little methods and things like that to make it easier to help you avoid those limits. So that's another big cue to when you should use an action. The other one is that screen interactions and outputs aren't always admin friendly. So one of the scenarios I'll cover here is using something like QuickChoice, where you might want to customize how a pick list appears, or making your pick list dynamic and pre-filling default values, things like that. Another popular one is the Datatable component, which I'll show. So the record choices in flow can be rather limiting. So you would potentially select one or multiple records out of a record choice variable. But the problem currently is that it might not output cleanly to a collection. You have to do some funky text manipulation to get your IDs, and then you got to figure out how to query for them. It's just not super clean. That's another great use case for using components. And the last one is asynchronous processing. So asynchronous versus synchronous processing, the best way I can describe that is synchronous processing is more or less like the most common form of a transaction in Salesforce. You update an account record and Salesforce makes the update. It's synchronous. It waits for you to, it waits for Salesforce to tell you, hey, you're good, go forth and do more stuff. Versus asynchronous, which is, I don't care when this is done, just go and do it. And Salesforce says, okay, great. I will let you know when it's done at some point and when I have the resources to do it. So Flow doesn't have the capability out of the box to do asynchronous processing. So if you ever need to, for example, update 10,000 records, that's typically when you would want to think about using an asynchronous process. So Flow can't do that out of the box. So I'm going to show an action that can do that here real shortly. So another thing I wanted to talk about is this concept of multiplicative development, what I consider like the new age of development. Nowadays, developers, especially in the Salesforce ecosystem, are becoming more, can think of them more as multipliers for non-developers. So in the old days, you might have a developer create, a Visualforce page for a single use business need. Versus nowadays, you're starting to see with this growth of customized actions and reusable actions and components, you can see that one,
Apex class or invocable or Lightning component can be used in X number of business needs, all by an admin. And so you can think of these developers as folks that are enabling a group of admins or a group of business needs. So it's becoming extremely powerful. So the first scenario we're going to cover is when you need to present a slick choice of buttons that from there then shows a filtered list of records on a screen that the user can pick from to do something with. So the three actions I'm going to show here are QuickChoice, which is one of Unofficial SF's one of the most popular actions, Datatable, which is an extremely popular one as well, and then another one which I would say probably 98% of you have probably not seen, called SOQL Datatable by James Hu. And so basically the big difference between Datatable and SOQL Datatable is that the SOQL Datatable can be placed pretty easily on a Lightning record page. And if you do that, you can also launch flows from within the Datatable, which is pretty neat. And it's all controlled via custom metadata. And then, of course, the Datatable that a lot of you have seen, it's gone through years of development. It supports Apex-defined types and just way too many features to list. And then QuickChoice, of course, allows you to do direct navigation presses. So if you want to have a user press a button or a choice and then have it navigate to a different screen, you can do that. You can show custom images in your choices. You can do pre-filled values, requiredness, and supports none. Now, the one thing I will mention is that the newest version of Datatable, version 3, is not compatible with the SOQL Datatable currently. There's a naming conflict right now between the two of them. So you basically have to either pick one or the other, or do Datatable v2 and SOQL Datatable. So just keep that in mind. We'll make a note of that when it's addressed in a future version. So here we are on the sample flow. And basically what we have here is a simple choice where I can pick the two different data tables that I want to show off, and then a quick choice that basically allows us to pick two different account types for the user. So for the first example, I'll just show the SOQL data table. Functionally, it'll be pretty similar for the end user, but it has a big difference in the admin experience. So we'll just pick the SOQL data table, and then we'll pick the channel accounts. So you notice how when I pressed it, it took me directly to the next page. So you can hide that next button if you really want to. So what we're looking at here is a dynamic SOQL statement generated from flow in a text variable. So I just showed this on screen just so you could see it, but it's pretty neat because you can do stuff like where subqueries and lots of things that you couldn't do with just a generic collection variable as an input. So for the folks that have used Datatable a lot, this will be pretty neat for you. And so from here, you can hide the checkboxes. You can do the radio buttons just like you can with the regular data table. And then for the records that you select, it outputs a nice clean record collection for you to act upon or loop over or do whatever you want with. So for the next example, I'll show the traditional data table, which is also amazing. So largely the same. I just threw in an extra column here for account ID, but same idea. Select your records, and then you can output a collection of records. And you can loop over them, you can update them, show them again in another screen. You can hide these checkboxes to make it view only for the user. You can do all sorts of things, all linked in that post, in the slides that I'll post. So it's a pretty simple example here, but it gives you an idea of the type of things that you could do from a visual perspective for the user. And so what I'll do here is I will walk you through some of the different elements. So your quick choice here, this is what I use to pick the data table quickly. Your values are basically just a collection of text variables. So if you think about a simple text variable, you basically put in one value. Well, you can also do a text collection variable, which is you can think of it as a a group of text variables that you can put in to this input. It makes it a lot easier to set up quick choices, to create a simple admin experience. So you don't have to go through the nauseating experience of creating 20 different choices when you really just want to do something quick and easy. And then here you can see the visual choices. So I have here visual cards, and then I have pressed show icons and then instant navigation mode. When that's pressed, you can basically instantly trigger the next button. And then here, this is all in the actual QuickChoice post, but you can see how to configure it within the unofficial SF post. And then here's the SOQL data table. So you can see I just showed the SOQL query string that I generated in here, which is basically just a text template field using plain text, which is the input for the SOQL query string. You basically pick your object and your SOQL query string. I didn't actually pick any of these input values, but you can do multi, none, or single selects. You can pick the names of your column labels, choose what fields are editable, show a record count, so you can even have numbered lists, and then specify what fields are actually sortable in the columns. And then, of course, we have your traditional data table. So for this purpose, I have V2 just because, like I mentioned before, you can't have V3 and SOQL data table installed in the same place. Until that's resolved, I won't be able to show V3. But for now, V2, pretty easy to set up as well. You basically specify what fields you want. That is their API names here. And then your input, which is your record collection. And there are just way too many inputs to talk through here. They all have nice helpful help bubbles, and then of course we have the lengthy unofficial SF post that talks through each of these. But for the most part, it's pretty easy to set up. You can see how I don't really have most of them set up. There's just so many different options that you can go through to have these selectable. So the next scenario I'm going to talk through is the large data volume scenario. So let's say you need to update over 5,000 records in a screen flow, and that value is also a multi-select pick list that needs to be selectable by the user. So there are three actions here that we're going to show off. One is the DualListBox component, also a pretty popular one, the MapCollection component, and the MassTransactor component. And there's a little helper action as well. I don't really call it out here for DualListBox called GetPicklistValues, which I'll show in a moment. But the big thing here is that it addresses that scenario. Actually, it addresses two different scenarios, not just one. It also shows off asynchronous processing using that MassTransactor action. It basically lets you create, update, or delete a record collection asynchronously from flow. And you can specify your batch size, you can get the outputted job ID, and then from there you can do a get on that job ID to get the status of it and then show it on screen, which is what I'll be showing off in a moment. And then MapCollection basically lets you update values in a record collection before it hits the database. So it's all in memory. This allows you to do mass updates for thousands upon thousands of records without any sort of loops. And then DualListBox, which is a pretty nifty replacement for displaying multi-select values. It'll let you basically pre-fill based off of a text variable, and then you can output it to a collection of text variables as well to either use it in another screen or use it as a value for a multi-select pick list, which I'll show off in just a second. So here is the example of using MassTransactor in a flow. So the first screen we have here is just a DualListBox with a bunch of different options. So this is going to be our multi-select pick list value that we update. So you can see here we just have a few choices. It's a little cleaner than the out-of-the-box multi-select. So we have our selected values, and we hit next. Just to show you what the output is, you can do a text collection or you can do a comma separated value text variable. So in this case, I went with the CSV value,
And then I use a formula field to basically convert that comma to a semicolon, which makes it ready to be updatable in a multi-select. All right, so basically what we just did here is, I'll show you over here in the debug log. Well, maybe I won't. It's a little long. I'll walk you through it in the flow. But basically, we took the value of the multi-select and used the MapCollection action to update an existing record collection, basically what we did in the very beginning of the flow. And then, using the job ID from MassTransactor, I was able to pull the details of that job and display it on screen. So if I hit next, it'll say completed, and then batches processed 5. So I can show you what that means in just a moment, but pretty cool stuff. Lets you basically show the results to the user real time, as long as they hit next. So just to walk you through it, what we do here is we grab our accounts that we want to update. This is just a simple sandbox, so there's not that many accounts, but you could do as many as 10,000 if you wanted to. Then we do this GetPicklistValues action, where we put in the field name, the object name, and then you can see it outputs a collection of values here. A text collection, that is. So here we have our DualListBox component. And you can see you have the option of 2 inputs. One is a comma-separated string. The other is a text collection, which is what the output of that GetPicklistValues is. So here we're just showing the output of that value. And then you can see here in the formula is what I use for the actual picklist value and the update. So it's a simple substitute of the value with a comma to a semicolon. So then here is our map collection action, which is also available on the official Trailhead Recipes website, which I'll post a link to in the slides. But basically, it's can get a little tricky, the formatting. There's a post on Unofficial SF on the format, but essentially it's JSON, and you have little curly brackets here on the left, your field, and then the value you want to update. And I wouldn't recommend using this video as the tutorial. There's plenty of examples out there, but the big deal here is that you're basically updating the values in the flow before it's actually committed to the database. So here's the new one that most of you probably haven't seen, which is the MassTransactor action. We just call it DML records asynchronously. So it sounds fancy, but it's actually relatively simple in what it does. So you basically specify your operation type, update, create, delete, your input, which are the records you want to update, your batch size. So this can be as many records as you need. You know, the actual parameters are in the MassTransactor post. But essentially, this will mean that the job will be processing 5 records per job. And this is pretty handy in scenarios where you might have an object that has a lot of tech debt. And let's say you tried to update 200 records at once, and you get lots of governor limits. Well, this would be a way to fix that. So, well, it's more of a Band-Aid, honestly, but it's a way to get around those limitations. So you could do something like your batch size of 5, and you might have 100 records. Well, that's going to give you 20 jobs of 5 batches. Or excuse me, 1 job of 20 batches with a batch size of 5. And then if you want to, you can also send an email when it completes. So you can have a text variable for your body of the email, the address that you want to send it to, and then your subject. Relatively simple. It doesn't necessarily support multiple email addresses yet, but if you'd like to contribute, you are welcome to on the Unofficial SF repo. So then the next step here is we get the Apex job using the output of the MassTransactor. And we just get the job ID. And then we show it on screen using the results of that get record.
And then when they hit next, we just check to see if the status is not equal to completed. And then we loop back around and do another get on that job ID until it's done.
So the next action here is a scenario where you want to easily create some junction records, and you want to check for dupes while you do it. So there are two actions I'm going to show off. One is FindCommonAndUncommonRecords. I just made this a couple weeks ago to address a lot of scenarios where I just wanted to find the related records between two different collections, even scenarios where the two objects might be different. The other one is a really, really cool one called GenerateCollectionReport, which you can basically think of as a way to generate a read-only data table in HTML format. And you can put it in rich text fields, screens, and emails. And also, as of a couple weeks ago, now supports relationship fields and relationship field traversal, which is pretty neat. So for this example, I'm actually just going to hop into a record page because I think that is the most impactful way of showing this flow. So first what we're going to do is we have a pretty simple lookup component, just an out-of-the-box lookup component, and then a toggle component here. So what we're going to be doing is creating some junction records. It's a object I just called gas station ownerships. So we're going to be relating gas stations to an account. So in this case, we're going to be picking a bunch of gas stations from a lookup component, and then we're going to watch it real time as it adds. And then at the end, I'll show you how it dedupes using the find common and uncommon action. All right. So you can see here we have two gas stations related to this account, the Bluth family. And we have this little flow that we've embedded in the record page. So I'll just pick a couple gas stations. We pick one, we click add another, and then look at that. We have basically an action here that generates that HTML string I was talking about and shows it on here for you. And so you can kind of keep adding them. Add another, yeah. And let's pick one that is actually already related to the account. So you can see the station 215 wasn't added again because of the handy action that we have that checks for duplicates across those two objects. So let's hop in to the flow and see what's going on. So pretty simple. First step, just do a lookup of all the different gas stations that are already related to that account with that junction object. So here's what we got going on with the screen. So we have a lookup here. It's just a simple lookup to gas stations. A little toggle button makes a nice little presentation for asking the user if they want to keep adding more. And then we have this little text string here, show unique selected records. Well, what is that? So what we'll do here after the screen, we'll do a get, since unfortunately the lookup component or the out-of-the-box lookup component doesn't actually export a record, so we have to look up that record. So we store that, and then we add the selected gas station to a collection variable, and then we run the generate collection report, which gives us an output of some HTML string that we can show on a screen. So you can see here I have the name field shown and then the station ID field, and then I say I want it shown in a table and then the actual input. Now all of these you can actually just check out on the actual unofficial SF post, but you can do some cool CSS styling in there as well. And we check to see if that toggle was checked, and if it was, we go back to the screen. If not, we run this handy dandy action called the get common and unique records, or get common and uncommon records. So if you've used invoked actions before, basically if you have an input and an output of an object, you get asked ahead of time what those objects are. So in this case we have 2 inputs and then 4 outputs. And that is to account for scenarios where you might have, you're trying to compare 2 objects of different types. So all we do really is we specify the source collection. In this case, it's the gas stations already related to the account.
the ID we want to compare against in the target collection. So in this case, it's gas station. It's just the ID of the gas station, and this is the gas station on that junction record. So we're basically trying to tie those two IDs together across objects. And then in the output, you can see here all we really cared about was the actual gas station's unique to the account. So we just basically outputted it to that. But you can also do the gas stations related to, and then in the two different object formats. So you have your gas stations and gas station ownerships. So it's actually pretty powerful that you can actually do that and compare across two unlike objects. It's pretty neat and pretty handy, I'll say. So then, of course, we just loop over that collection of the output of the unique records to make our junction records, and we create those relationships. All right, so let's talk about due diligence. I've learned a lot through using a lot of these actions and components, and I felt like I should at least share some of the high-level points. The first is, don't assume everything is 100% quality. Do your own code review with your developers and your client if you're a consultant, and make sure they understand that it's not always going to be top of work, right? A lot of these components and actions, people aren't getting paid for this. It's on their own time. So they might have a limited way of testing some of the actions that they've made because they don't have every use case in mind. They don't have the luxury of having 100 people test their code. So do your own testing in your own scenarios. The second one is test class manipulation. So for those that are not Apex developers, you should know that every Apex class has to be tested by an Apex test class. So what that means is for unlocked and unmanaged packages, if you're going to be deploying code from these actions into your production org, they are going to have to pass through an Apex test class. So what do you do in an Apex test class? Well, you're basically creating mock data and triggering your code to run. So what that means is a lot of times you have to create data. And if you have a test class that tries to create an account, let's say you have a validation rule on your account that requires a city, and that test class doesn't include a city, it's going to fail. So what that means is you should expect that if you have validation rules or Apex validations or anything like that, and you're trying to install these in your org, you might have to get some help modifying some of these test classes. Now, this is not an issue for the flow-based actions pack because that is a managed package, or at least the newest version is. So keep that in mind when you're trying to install some of these actions. And the next one is bulkification isn't free. So bulkification is on the developer, and this is about Apex actions, by the way. It is on the developer to implement. So you should always test downloaded or reused code, especially when you're trying to use invoked actions in either a auto launch flow or a record triggered flow. Because if your code or action executes something like SOQL, and you have 101 records triggered in a transaction, and each one of those wasn't bulkified, then what you're going to end up with are governor limit issues. So test out these in both small record volumes and larger record volumes to make sure that the action is bulkified. So upgrades. This is a tricky one. So if you remember your admin certification training, you'll remember that the difference between some of the packaging. So unmanaged packages can be made by pretty much anyone. You can do it in your developer org. Problem with them is they are not upgradable. Here comes unlocked packages to the rescue. Those are upgradable. However, you might run into issues with the test class if you're trying to get it deployed. So what does that mean? We have a handy-dandy article that Jack Pond wrote about tips and tricks for updating and upgrading managed and unmanaged, unlocked and unmanaged packages. So check this article out for some tips and tricks. One thing I did notice, and this may be different now, but with unlocked packages, it can be pretty painful to deploy if you're using out-of-the-box chain sets to upgrade existing code. So if you've got an action in production, you install the next version in your sandbox, you try to deploy it, you might have some issues with chain sets. So what I would recommend doing is actually following the same article right above there and removing the actual Apex class from the unlocked package and then trying to deploy the Apex class. So the last little tidbit here is null versus empty collection outputs. So if you're a flow master, you'll know that you should be doing null checks in your flows before you're doing creates and updates and things like that. The one thing is some of these actions will output empty collections instead of null. So null checks will not work. So one thing that I've done in the past is I have assigned a number field to collections using an assignment. So that is one way you can get around that. All right, so you found this great action and you're super excited to show the either the client, a customer, or your architect on your team, and they say, I don't know how I feel about custom code. I'm not into it. Well, have a conversation with them. Sometimes people just kind of give up when they hear code. So, and this kind of goes back to my second or third slide about how code is really changing shape. It's moving away from single use to modular multi-use code. So try to understand what's driving the hesitance of using code. Is it just they don't like not knowing what they're putting in their org because they didn't write it, or they just don't feel comfortable with packaging? Try to understand where they're coming from. For the next one is fit. You might have a flow that has 10 loops in it just to do one little thing. That's kind of telling you that it's probably not the right tool or not the right method for the job. And when you start stretching flow beyond what it was really meant to do out of the box, you can kind of hit performance impacts and performance limits. So try and use that as a way to have a conversation with your stakeholder. The next one is multi-use, and this goes directly back to the very beginning, right? This is modular, reusable code that can solve many different problems versus, a single Apex class that solves one issue for one time. And the other one is maintainable, right? These are all open, for the most part, all open source and freely available. Anyone can contribute to them and make them better. So you already have the advantage of someone else. Sometimes they break it, but also sometimes they fix the things that they were meaning to fix. But you can think of that as almost free development. The other one is customizable. So, and this is a big difference between installing, some sort of managed package online. You can't actually modify managed package code versus the content that's coming in from these unmanaged and unlocked packages, which, you can hop in and see exactly what all of this stuff really does, so that if you have stakeholders that are hesitant to install third-party stuff, you can say, all right, cool, here's the code. If you'd like to look at it, feel free. And so the last one is, this is all freely available. All of this stuff is on the automation component library in unofficial SF and just throughout GitHub in the community. If the client, customer, or your stakeholder doesn't want to install the packages that are frequently offered on all of these articles, you can just use the code. You can hop into the repository and you can copy and paste the code into your dev console, and no need to install anything. So, there are lots of options for a lot of these components. And lastly, I'll just say, you might be feeling a little hesitant to jump in, but don't be too discouraged. You might surprise yourself in what you can accomplish, especially starting small with, adding a field or two into a test class. That's exactly how I started. I was pretty hesitant to hop into these because, I didn't feel super comfortable with the code aspect of it. But I learned by doing. I started small, adding little lines here and there into a test class. And then, by the end of it, I was writing my own actions, and I ended up motivating myself to get the platform developer one certification, even though I come from an admin background. So you can do it, is what I'm saying. So finding components is easy. A lot of you are already coming from unofficialsf.com, which you know as the main place that Flownetics and Salesforce admins and developers go to find reusable actions and components. The other place that you can go to is the automation components trailhead spot, where you can get managed packages through a lot of these actions. So a lot of the stuff on this repository comes from Unofficial SF. It's just been cleaned up by some Salesforce engineers. And so third, if you want to make your own, there's a nice article here on Unofficial SF on understanding invocables and how they work. And then lastly, if you need help with a specific action, if you think something's wrong or broken, feel free to log an issue on our GitHub repository. And then if you need help with setting up an action or how to use it, I recommend the Automation Trailblazer group. That's a great resource. It's a very active group. We also have an Unofficial SF Trailblazer group, but I would say that the Automation group is more active. And lastly, if you're in the mood to chat, there's the Salesforce Exchange Discord server, which is a fantastic resource for getting started or getting ideas for solutions and things like that I am a big fan of. So with that, I would like to thank you guys for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to make a comment on the Unofficial SF post down below, or you can mention me on the Trailblazer group.